I'm Louanne Moldovan with the Signet Radio Hour. Today I am sitting with Gemma Whelan, and with all transparency, Gemma is my friend first, and happily for me, she happens to also be born in Ireland, the artistic director of Corrib Theatre, a gifted artist, and a brilliant, funny, caring woman. Lucky me. Hello, Gemma.
Hello, Louanne. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Gemma, as I said, was born in Ireland. So how old were you when you left Ireland?
I was 21. I was a baby. I left the minute I finished my exams at Trinity College, Dublin, where I did a degree in English, French, and Fine Arts, and basically had no clue what I wanted to do with my life. And I knew I didn't want to do the things that people with those degrees typically do, which was teach. Mm-hmm. I actually ended up doing a lot of teaching, but of theatre in the future. But that I didn't even envision that. So because of that, I left on a student visa to the United States.
And how long did you know you wanted to leave and come to the U.S.?
In my last year, in all transparency, I applied for a visa to Australia and the U.S., and I got one to the U.S., So, but I was interested in either country. I think I was interested in just new horizons and getting out of Ireland, and, which felt very constricted at the time and felt they were limited. I may not have 100% understood this at the time, but I did have a feeling of walls closing in and of there being no opportunities for young women. Or they were limited, there would be a primary school teacher in which then because you could work after you got married. Other jobs, you still had to actually stop after you got married, but there weren't even that many available. Nurse, primary school teacher, working in a bank. They were the jobs.
I have to say, so Gemma is not that old. It's like I'm listening to you.
It sometimes sounds like I'm talking about the 19th century.
Yes.
But I was not born in the 19th century.
No. That's so different for, somebody like me. I can't imagine growing up and coming to the point where I knew I had to leave the country of my birth.
I grew up in the 60s and 70s. So things were, they were just very different. Ireland has changed so drastically now. It's almost like a different country.
Is it? Since you've left?
Since I've left. And I would say probably actually as late as the 90s is when things started to change. In terms of what I would call becoming more modern. The 80s was a really tough time because I remember being over here and not sure, because I wasn't here that long, and wondering, not sure if I would go back, and my parents even saying, it's full of unemployment. There's nothing here now, which they had never said before. I didn't leave because I couldn't get a job. I left to experience more freedom and to try out things that I felt I couldn't in Ireland. It was really to spread my wings. I didn't know I was leaving for good, which it turns out I have.
Are you the only person in your family, in your circle of friends at the time who left?
Who left? Yes, actually, yes.
And did you know, like Brian Friel and Singh and all the rest of these wonderful Irish playwrights, were you aware of them from your studies in Ireland?
Yes, I had read some of their plays in Ireland. I hadn't read as much. I'd read a lot of Singh and O'Casey, and but not as much Brian Friel. And I had, in fact, I think the first Brian Friel play that I ever saw was in New York while I was there for that year, and it was Philadelphia, Here I Come, which was one of his early-ish ones. Which is about immigration. So it was, and this sort of divided self, I suppose you could say. And it's very different, but I suppose it connects to some of his later, I think of Faith Healer as such a masterpiece and so mature in terms of the writing.
And that duality,
that duality was always there. So it was there from the beginning. In Philadelphia, Here I Come, it was more, I'm not sure how to explain it. It was literal. It was literal. It wasn't metaphoric. Because it was somebody who talked to himself. He had his inner voice and his outer voice, if I remember the character. And he was leaving, and I think it was Ballybeg. I think Ballybeg already had been established in County Donegal. And he was emigrating, and he was emigrating because he had to. So it was all, I think it took place the night before he left, but he was sort of fighting with himself or arguing with himself and with other people. And so that divided
Similar
consciousness.
Twist, right. Divided consciousness, in which Frank does in Faith Healer. And they're all working through those struggles, as you say, internally.
Yes.
That's shared with us as an audience. I want to ask you about the Troubles in Ireland. How do you think, if you would elaborate just for those listening who may not have a specific reference to that, but also how it impacted Brian Friel's writing?
He was born in Derry, and the actual name of Derry is Londonderry. And so even the name itself gives a clue, because there's a huge Catholic population in Derry, and many of them refuse to call it Londonderry, and it's part of Northern Ireland. Okay, so to go back, I won't go back too far, but in 1921-22, the six counties in the north of Ireland broke off from the south, and they became Northern Ireland, and they're run by Britain, and they still are to this day.
Protestant?
So there were Northern Ireland. One of the reasons they broke off, and they did it themselves. Well, like everything, it's complicated. But starting in the 1600s, the British took over Ireland, basically, when the colonization started. They did it province by province. There were 4 provinces in Ireland. And the north was the first to be colonized. And because it's so close to Scotland, it's only 13 miles across from Larne to Stranraer. They gave the land, when they took it away from the native Irish, the same as they did with the rest of Ireland, little by little, they gave it to their Scottish or Scottish descendant soldiers or landowners. They basically became, and they were Protestant, so Presbyterian, right? So over the years, so starting in 1609 was when Ulster was. It's called the Plantation of Ulster. And Ulster is the Northern Irish province. So, fast forward many, many years, hundreds of years of struggling to have Ireland united, and because Ireland was ruled by England for all of those years. And but in 1916, there was a very famous uprising, which eventually led to, after a civil war, to Ireland gaining independence. And when that happened, because at that point, the north of Ireland was heavily Presbyterian, heavily Protestant. Catholics were in the minority. And they didn't want to be the majority did not want to be part of Catholic Ireland, very closely identified with Catholic and Catholicism and the Pope and allegiance to the Pope.
They didn't want to be associated with that.
They did not.
So they wanted to be aligned with
Also, economically,
Britain?
they were better off than the South of Ireland because of their ties to England economically over the years. So they wanted to be part of England, and they were part of England, and they are part of England still today. So in 1968, there was the beginning of a civil rights. There was growth over the years of civil rights because Catholics had been discriminated against historically all of those years in the minority, for jobs, huge job discrimination, voting. So the civil rights march, what started as a peaceful civil rights march, ended up the British Army was brought in. And there was, a few years later, Bloody Sunday is maybe some people will know, but fire was opened. They opened fire on peaceful protesters who were unarmed. People were killed. So it escalated into what became known as the Troubles that lasted for 30 years.
When did the IRA form?
The IRA actually is originally the IRB, or the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and then they became the Irish Republican Army. They had been around since the beginning of the 20th century. So they were around, I'm not sure exactly the date, but this was not a new organization. It's just they were underground for most of the 30s, 40s, 50s.
And would you say they're the Catholic sort of branch?
Yes.
But would you say, you don't say Southern Ireland. What do you say to distinguish it from Northern Ireland?
In terms of the IRA?
Or just like that?
The IRA is everywhere.
Geographically speaking, Northern Ireland is England, And then is it Ireland then? The rest is Ireland.
The rest is the Republic of Ireland.
The Republic of Ireland.
Yes, politically, that's how they're. And there are some counties in Northern Ireland, 3, one of which is Donegal, that is not part of Northern Ireland. So we get to the split, and Brian Friel, he was born in Derry, or Londonderry, a Catholic in a predominantly Protestant environment. And by the way, for years, we say Protestant and Catholic, and it's labeling, so it helps you to understand the situation. But it's much more complicated than that. And it wasn't like they weren't fighting over religion. They were fighting over rights, basically civil rights. And but because of religion, people were being discriminated against, right? Or they were seen as lesser. And they didn't have the same access to education and so on that the dominant group did. So Brian Friel, but for, many, many, many years, Catholics and Protestants, they were next door neighbors. They were friends. They just lived in the same place. They got on fine until this happened, until the match was lit, as it were.
Bloody Sunday.
And and there were events before Bloody Sunday, but that was like a huge one. And and basically there was guerrilla warfare for 30 years until the late 90s when a peace treaty was signed.
So those were the Troubles, that 30-year period.
That's called the Troubles. So Brian Friel lived through that, and he was in Derry. I forget when he was born. I think he was born in the 40s. And
actually,
because he died, he was
1929.
Oh, sorry. Of course he would. Sorry, 1929, because he lived through. So I was thinking he would have come to maturity. He would have been there like during the 40s, 50s. And early 60s when it would be peaceful, like a totally peaceful place. But then in 68, starting 68, 69 is when, with the marches and the riots and everything, sort of all hell broke loose. But as a child, he used to he had relatives in Donegal, which is where his family came from. So he would go to the relative peace then of Donegal. And Donegal is, for those of you, the people who don't know it, it's the it's in the northwest, the extreme northwest of Ireland. It's really beautiful, it's known really as sort of an idyllic, and it is gorgeous. It's one of my favorite counties. It has lakes, it has the Atlantic coastline, and he went there, and there's probably an idyllic association, in some ways it was peaceful, right? Because it's peace. It was at peace, whereas right across the border. So you have this, again, it's a border. There's a border situation. And I think that leads into, in terms of the mentality. And we talked about the split and
the duality too.
The duality,
right? Yeah,
again,
that makes so much sense.
Is there, yeah. And of course, he set Ballybeg then in Donegal, which is interesting. That did not mean that his plays are free of conflict, because they are not.
No, they're obviously
They're full of conflict.
Yes, an opportunity for him to offer that expression from, into a poetic, lyrical way from his writing.
That's right.
Because Ballybeg is this fictional town that he created, but it's a word that exists in Irish. What does it mean?
It means small town. So Baile is the Irish for town, and Beag is small. So, and then it becomes beg when you put it with another word. So Ballybeg is the anglicized version of Baile Beag.
And so with Faith Healer and certainly, surely with his other plays, he encapsulates the political upheaval and the life of an artist, you know, the great conflict in being an artist, as you and I know, and religion, faith. Do you think that you wonder as somebody's crafting this beautiful piece of writing, like how much of it is deliberate and how much of it is just sort of this distillation of one's life?
I mean, I do not, I would not presume to get into the mind of Brian Friel, but my sense is just from the work itself and where it comes, in his oeuvre. He, to use a lovely Irish word, Faith Healer is such a, I think it's okay to call it a masterpiece, because it is a masterpiece. It's such a beautiful, It's so, everything is so distilled. I'm assuming, like, I can't imagine laboring over something like this. But of course, the labor, or meaning that the labor is not visible because it's so seamless and so gorgeous.
Yeah.
And, but also, as you said, I mean, Faith Healer, in terms of the conflicts and the challenges of being an artist, literally, Frank, the main character in the Faith Healer, is described all over the place as an artist and as a performer, and it was always a performer's. So, you know, the analogy or the metaphor of the artist is not that far below the surface in some ways there. And he was so, Frank, the character, is so conflicted. And it made him so unhappy, really. It made him such a conflicted person. I hope Brian Friel, and I don't think he was such a conflicted person. And he also, Brian Friel himself, lived a very long life, a very long, nice life.
Yes.
So it didn't, you know, it didn't do him in. He managed to keep writing, wrote many wonderful plays after The Faith Healer. But there's so much in there because it's not an overtly political play at all. But he manages to sneak things in, like, you know, grace. Yeah, and the duality as well. I mean, he describes. I don't want to give too much away.
Just about her character and she comes from a different class of people.
Yes, because she's a higher class than he is. And she's also, you know, he calls her British and he lies about where she comes. And I don't think that's giving away anything because that's the whole thing is you don't know what to believe.
Well, I think we can say it's safe to say it's a Rashomon type of a story.
Very much Rashomon type story.
Great fascination to it already. There's so much exemplified in it of as we've, you know, faith and his own, you know, struggles. Well,
yes.
I can't even think of Brian Friel as struggling, which is perhaps a naive thing to say, but, you know, because he wrote so brilliantly.
He wrote so brilliantly. I mean, his early plays are not on the level of brilliance as his later plays. And, you know, they are more overt, I think, in some ways, even Freedom of the City. And they're lovely plays. I mean, he still managed to write wouldn't I give anything to be able to write any play that he wrote. But I think critically people agree that later on his more mature plays are definitely on another level. Of course, if you start at a high level, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
But things like Faith Healer and I think translations are just so luminous.
I read this fun little anecdote. Donald McCann, who was probably Ireland's greatest actor, who played Frank twice.
Yes.
Joe Dowling directed, who
that's right.
started at the Abbey and then ran the Guthrie for many years. Exactly. And Conal McCann, who was in The Dead, if people had seen that film by John Huston.
Yes.
He did film and television, but the stage was his sacred place.
Right.
And he mentioned how he came off stage, having done Frank in The Faith Healer, had just opened, and the audience was applauding, and he came backstage in the dark, and he felt heat on one cheek and coolness on the other, and it was Brian Friel kissing him on one cheek and holding a cocktail to the other. He was so pleased.
Oh my goodness! That's great. First thing I thought of was duality. I didn't know what was going to come with the second cheek when you told that story. And of course, also, and that was a conflict for Donald McCann as well. He was pretty troubled too. I mean, it's also when you talk about the process, we mentioned it in terms of the playwright, but also in terms of the performer or the actor. And he was quite a brilliant and troubled in some ways as well. Artist.
Yes. And he, I think, dealt with alcoholism until at one point he stopped in the 80s. Apparently it was like.
Yes, he did stop. Finally. But it was a huge struggle. So that's when you said the kiss on one hand and the cocktail. It's like the cocktail was, I'm sure, meant as a in a very positive way.
Yes, unless it was before. It might have been before he had, gone sober.
Oh, I'm sure it was. Yeah. Oh, I'm sure it was. I doubt Brian Friel would have done that to him. No.
What would you say to an audience member listening to Faith Healer who is unfamiliar with Ireland and its religion and history, its culture and its politics?
Yeah, I think, I think it's right that there is, for most Irish playwrights and writers, And Ireland is famous for its writers, you know, and it's like George Bernard Shaw, and it's I think the only country that still has four Nobel laureates in literature, and it's tiny. I mean, it really is tiny. It's a tiny country, and I think the history is so tortured. I think that is part of it. Is it's ingrained, you know, because of the and some of that. I mean, it's colonization. It was colonized, but you can't blame the British for everything. And of course they can be blamed for a lot, but not for everything. And when the Irish got their own freedom, this is really interesting because many of the playwrights that you mentioned, including Brian Friel, I mean, he lived in independent, you know, Ireland, except, I mean, he was in Northern Ireland, but it chose to be that way. It chose to be part of Britain. But once Ireland gained its independence, it's not like it suddenly became a benign place.
Oh, no, everything became peaceful.
In fact, it was then the Catholic Church, and I think the paternalism took over. So there was always this, I don't know. I mean, I can blame Catholicism, actually. I will do it right here. Because I think... Sinead, yeah. There's Sinead.
Up the Pope.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I want to emphasize the Irish brand of Catholicism, and I don't know why it was so horrible. And maybe it was they took a page from their colonizers, and actually held people down. They pushed people down.
I mean, and pregnant pregnant women, they taking their babies away, and all those graves
completely
they found.
Illegally. They just found like 800 dead babies, you know, buried in a sewer.
Right.
And then there's the sexual abuse scandals. And that was happening all over. The industrial schools were horrendous. So we just did a play at Corrib about that called James X, written by somebody who was in one of those industrial schools. Wow. So we're not talking ancient history here either,
no,
you know.
Exactly.
This is a man who's in his early 60s who wrote the play, and it was, it's medieval. It was medieval, really. Yeah. So there was something about the sackcloth and ashes, or the need to punish. I'm not sure what it is, but it has produced brilliant writing. And I'm glad to say the country, by the way, is very different now. I mean, this is, I feel... And I hope I'm right that a lot of that is in the past because people don't put up with it anymore, frankly, and women won't put up with it.
Like you did, ahead of your time.
Well, there you go. But I left, but the people who are there now are not putting up with it either, and they're standing up to the government, and they're speaking the truth. And in some ways, you know, they're repealing laws. I mean, that are regressive. And that keep people down, especially, and that punish women and children and those who don't have power. And I think Irish writers are renowned for their beautiful language, right?
You took the words right out of my mouth. I wanted to say that some of the most renowned and significant works of literature are in the English language from Irish writers.
Yes, and of course it's not our language. It's a language that was imposed upon us because our language is Irish or Gaelic, and which is one of I think his other most brilliant plays is translations, and it's about the moment in history in the 1700s, when the British basically did an ordnance survey of Ireland and changed all of the place names from Irish into English. And by doing so, altered so much of Irish history because there was so much contained in the names in Irish. So, and it, might end up meaning they anglicized things by the sound sometimes. So it was a completely different meaning than, it could have meant this place it's the Four Crossroads, and it's where, I don't know, the dances took place on a certain night, or this is where the bonfires were. And that could have been contained in the language that way. Or, this is the story of the Black Lake, whatever it is. So they erased a lot of the history. So I think it's, in some ways, maybe it's revenge, actually. Maybe I was going to say it's ironic, but maybe it's revenge, or a sweet kind of revenge that the Irish took the language and in their own particular brand of English managed to produce these wonderful works.
Well, that's a wonderful way to close, and specifically to Brian Friel's work, Faith Healer, that we will be presenting. The language, as you mentioned, the glorious language, the poetry, the lyricism, and the haunting, gripping, grief-ridden distillation of all that he lived through, and emblematic of Ireland itself, is just gorgeously, achingly presented or represented in Faith Healer. Would you agree?
I would agree. And I would, a note of caution, don't just be mesmerized by the language. And I think that's part of the beauty, it's beautiful, especially Faith Healer. It almost is magic and is mesmerizing. And it's much of it is like an incantation. And Frank even uses that word himself. But beneath it is the pain.
Yeah, and that's what I meant about the heartache.
Exactly.
That's all about the characters. So language is one part of it, but
yes.
But his crafting of these characters and the human condition is exquisite and gut-wrenching.
I agree.
So on that happy note,
yes.
Thank you for being here today, Gemma.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.